About 50 years ago, October 1973, October 6th to be exact, Israel was suddenly attacked by Syria and Egypt. And it was a moment when Israel's existence was totally threatened. A very dangerous moment in Israel's history. There were soldiers on what was called the Bar Lev line between Israel and Egypt. And it was a string of small fortresses. And it was protected at that moment by 450 second-line troops and a few young recruits from the Nachal Brigade. Across them were 100,000 Egyptian soldiers who attacked on that afternoon. In the north, the Syrian tanks were able to overcome the surprised and smaller resistance of the Israeli tanks on the Golan Heights. And they went through and were able to travel right into the north of Israel. It was a moment of true existential threat to Israel. Now, what saved the day and what saved Israel was the rapid deployment of the reservists. Most of Israel's army is not ready at that moment. They are reservists who served earlier in their lives, can be called up. But in 1973, this is not such a simple thing. In case you didn't realize it, there are no WhatsApp groups in 1973 to call everyone up. They literally had to go around every synagogue, every home where people were assembled, and find them. The reservists answered the call without any hesitation. And when the reservists arrived, that was the push that Israel needed to both withstand that onslaught and then turn it around. Now, if we think back to Israel's 75 years, and this month will be the 75th anniversary of Israel, there are only a few moments where Israel's existence was totally threatened, where external forces really put Israel in jeopardy. Perhaps at its inception in 1948, in the War of Independence. This moment in 1973, perhaps 67, though Israel was able to have a preemptive strike. The nuclear threat from Iran remains. And this moment in Yom Kippur, 1973. But while there have been these external threats, there's never really been an internal threat to Israel's existence. Even when there were divisions, think back to 1995, there was great turmoil between those who supported the Oslo peace accords with the Palestinians and those who opposed them. Those of us who were around then really saw this conflict. And then, of course, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. But even in that most dark and difficult times, it didn't really reach the level where we thought Israel itself was in danger. Until this past. This is a week unlike any other in Israel's history. We have on the one side a new government with leaders who speak openly about their hatred of Arabs, ministers calling for violence against Arabs and their villages, a kind of horrifying Jewish supremacy movement, similar to other movements we see around the world. And on the other side, there are these massive protests that we've seen. These are protests against the new government, against its damaging proposals. And these protests have grown and grown over the last 3 months. The government's call for judiciary reforms has brought fear to many Israelis who see the Supreme Court as the last bulwark that they have against extremism. That's not to say the court may not need some changes. But having the reforms come from this government where 4 out of the 5 top ministers have actually been convicted of crimes or actually are under indictment right now. These are the people who are the leaders. This is a government that was elected not by a landslide, by a difference of a few thousand votes. Perhaps this might not be the best government to make these types of changes. The changes would leave the courts subject to the legislative branch, and the legislative branch already controls the executive branch once they have a majority. This would be a dangerously monolithic structure with only one branch in power. So what did we see in the past week? We saw the prime minister continue moving his proposals forward, and we saw the protests growing and more talk of a horrifying thought of a civil war. Then after last Shabbat, last Saturday night, the defense minister, this is part of Netanyahu's inner circle, the second in command of Israel, stood up and said, we need to pause. He spoke out against these proposals. He stated that Israel was now in danger because, in particular, of one group. He mentioned the military reservists, the people who come out and actually need to defend the country when there is a crisis, that they oppose these proposals, that they are standing up against this. One group in particular, Israel's pilots, the best in the world, said, we're afraid to continue to report for duty because we don't want to serve in an army that could be taking orders from a government that could order us to do things that are problematic, that are unethical. And there's no court, if these reforms pass, there's no court that will defend us anymore against an unethical, racist, or problematic command. By the way, this is one of Israel's beautiful and powerful core values, that every soldier is taught Tohar HaNeshek, the ethical code of how you are supposed to serve. That if you are given an unethical command, you are to refuse it. Where does this come from? A very frightening experience that happened right before the state of Israel. It comes from the Shoah, from the Holocaust, where German soldiers said, well, I was just following orders. So Israel said, there's no such thing. You are given an unethical command, you don't follow orders. So we have the reservists standing up and saying that this country is heading in a dangerous direction. And then what happens the next night? Prime Minister of Israel fires the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, in a strange 2-sentence letter, and the rallies explode, become much larger with strikes across the country, impacting part of Ben Gurion Airport, universities, and more. 800,000 Israelis went out and protested. Just want to give you a sense of it because I can't really even comprehend it. That's 10% of the country. 10% of the United States. It would be about 35 million people. Just try to wrap your hands around that. 35 million people going out and rallying and protesting. It's pretty unheard of. And so finally, the prime minister caved, or sort of caved in. And he announced that he was delaying these reforms and he would enter a dialogue with the opposition. As you can imagine, his coalition, which wanted these reforms, this coalition that is far to the right, was very unhappy. We have the majority. Why would you pause? Will there be a sincere dialogue now? It's just a delay tactic, and the judicial reforms will continue. Who knows? But you know that having a prime minister who is actually under indictment pick out his own judges to try his cases doesn't feel to me like a great way to indict a prime minister, president, whatever. Now, I'm not a political prognosticator, or actually does anyone know what the future holds? But I will say this. Israel is in a vulnerable position, unlike one that is faced before. Now, we're here today, just a few days before Pesach. As we said, it's Shabbat HaGadol. It's this great Shabbat where we prepare for Pesach, the festival where our people experience freedom. They became a people. And there's a beautiful Haftarah that Ali just read so masterfully. And it concludes with the verse that she read twice. It's so important. Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliah hanavi bifnei bo yom hagadol v'hanora. Behold, I am sending to you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day. What will he do? Veshiv lev banot banim avot al banim uvelev banim al avotam. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the children to their parents. It's a very interesting haftarah. And one of the questions is, if Malachi wants to bring a vision of peace and reconciliation, why does he use the prophet Elijah? Why would you use Elijah? There are great prophets of peace. Pick your favorite one. Amos, with a mighty river flowing with justice. Isaiah, beat your swords into plowshares, as we just said in the prayer for our country. But he doesn't. He picks Elijah. What is Elijah best known for? A kind of violent confrontation with the priests of Baal, with these pagan worshipers. He doesn't choose the peacemaking prophets. Those would have been my go-tos. His famous act is to lead a strange grassroots rebellion. But underneath it, we can learn something. He's fighting these foreign gods, these different values that were trying to become part of the state religion, the state culture. And he stands up against Jezebel, this princess from Phoenician origin, the wife of King Ahab or Achav. And those values that they represented were seeing the monarch as above the law. In such a milieu, there's not space for Israel's God. There's not space for Israel's ideology about protecting the weak, about standing up for those who are vulnerable. In that kind of world, people mostly see their own interests. And so that's Elijah's battle. Elijah teaches us to look beyond ourselves and warns us of the danger of a leader who has too much power. Author and teacher Vered Hollander Goldfarb points out that Malachi wants to warn us that danger not only comes from external threats, but from internal ones, from ourselves. Malachi is yearning or reflecting a yearning for an Elijah who will come to save us from ourselves. He's speaking around the year 510 before the Common Era, just 75 years after the destruction and the tragedy of the loss of the temple in Jerusalem. Malachi wants to warn us that there can be a terrible day like that again. Things can be even worse than when the Babylonians destroyed our temple. So he calls upon Elijah not to fight. He calls upon Elijah to bring a different message, a message of reconciliation, that Elijah will help reconcile parents and children. The Mishnah brings a couple of different rabbinic voices about what does this mean? Why are we reconciling parents and children? And they expand it. Rabbi Shimon says it's not just parents and children, it's to heal the rifts within society. It's about reconciling disputes that are larger than just your family. People who should be close or who have been close, who now find themselves in conflict. This type of internal hate, that the rabbis then refer to as sinat chinam, is dangerous. It was, according to them, the infighting and that hate that destroyed the second temple. And so Elijah will heshiv lev avot al banim. Elijah will bring us back together. will remind us to turn back to one another, remind us to open our hearts to each other, to listen to each other, particularly to those who do not feel heard. Now, in Israel, as in many other places in the world, see people who feel that they don't belong. They feel threatened and alienated. That goes for the people who voted in this government, and that goes for the people who are protesting against it. I want to leave us with a message of hope today. If we can use our abilities and follow Elijah's message, maybe we can turn to one another, turn aside from the brink. There are hopeful signs in Israel. I want you just to understand, with 800,000 people in the streets, massive protests, there was almost no violence, no guns. Even when shutting down a highway, it's a fascinating video of an ambulance being let through the crowd. Danny Gordis brought this video. You could see everyone just parting ways and bringing the ambulance through. Because people understand that while they might stand up for something, there's something greater that they're standing up for. It's the future of the Jewish and democratic state of Israel. There were brave statements this week by the defense minister standing up. There were statements by the virtually unknown Attorney General, Gali Barahav Miara, who stood up to the prime minister doing her job. There was the consul general to New York who spoke his mind, who resigned in protests of Gallant's firing. All of this gives me some hope that Lev, Avot, and Banim, the hearts of Israelis, and really all of us, find a way to come together. Because if not, Malachi warns us, things may not go so well. There may be no reservists come in, save the day. May that not come to pass. Shabbat shalom.